welcome and thank you for joining us today for our discussion on the impacts of GPS jamming and spoofing on civilians. My name is Clayton Swope. I'm the Deputy Director of the Aerospace Security Project here at CSIS. I'll be your moderator today. This is an important discussion because of global trends. Reports of GPS interference around the world are on the rise, including at sea, on land, in the air, in places like Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Oftentimes, GPS interference seems tied to conflict areas. Many of these reports that we learn about come from commercial airline pilots and crews of maritime shipping vessels who rely on GPS data to safely transport their passengers and cargo. Joining me today is Lisa Dyer, the Executive Director of the GPS Innovation Alliance, Andy Uribe, First Officer and Aviation Security Subject Matter Expert for the Airline Pilots Association, and Dave Turner, Senior Professional Staff Member on the Senate Commerce Committee. I want to give a special thanks before we start to Lisa for doing the lion's share of work to make today's event happen. So thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, and thank you for the team at CSIS for making this possible.
You're welcome. I want to remind all our viewers that we are taking questions from the audience. You can find the link to ask a question at the bottom of our CSIS event page. So with that, I want to start by just asking each of our participants to introduce himself or herself before we're going to move on to the broader discussion. So we'll start with Lisa.
Great, thank you very much. My career actually started in the Air Force. I worked at Los Angeles Air Force Base and Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Had the opportunity to work at the State Department for several years working on space and technology policy. And most recently, I spent about 5 years in San Francisco working on artificial intelligence and at a startup working on fundraising and supply chain issues. So love to bring all of that to the GPS Innovation Alliance. It all seems to fit, so thank you.
All right, good morning. My name is Andy Uribe. I am here on behalf of the Airline Pilots Association International. ALPA is the world's largest pilot union. We represent over 78,000 pilots at 41 US and Canadian airlines. More importantly, though, we consider ourselves to be the largest non-governmental aviation safety and security organization. I am a pilot volunteer working in the Aviation Security Department. Additionally, I fly for a U.S. airline whose pilots are represented by ALPA. I fly internationally, and I've done so on Airbus and Boeing aircraft. Before this career, I was in the U.S. military, flew for 26 years, and I utilized GPS for navigation and weapons employment. I'm pleased to be here.
All right, and I'm Dave Turner. As Clayton said, I am the Senior Professional Staff Member for the Space and Science Subcommittee of the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, chaired by Senator Maria Cantwell. The subcommittee has jurisdiction over national and civil space policy and legislation, and oversight of science, technology, engineering, research and development, and technical standards development and measurement. So we oversee NASA, we oversee the National Institute of Standards and Technology, National Science Foundation, the Office of Commercial Space Transportation within the FAA, and the Office of Space Commerce within the Department of Commerce, National Space Council, White House OSTP, and the U.S. Arctic Commission. So certainly all things space-related and many things science-related. Probably the reason I was invited here today, though, is prior to this position, I had 15 years of experience in the U.S. State Department, working specifically on space cooperation and on cooperation and dialogues, both bilateral and multilateral, related to global navigation satellite systems and our policy to promote the use of GPS worldwide for peaceful uses. And I think for now I will stop there. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, sure, you're welcome. I'm glad to have you all here. I think this is a really interesting group that has perspectives from industry, both as a user, both as builder, as a policymaker, in different roles within the government. So I think all of those backgrounds and experiences are going to be really valuable when we talk about the civilian impacts today. I thought, to start us off, maybe Andy, if you wouldn't mind, just telling us from your experience as a user, as someone who operates aircraft, has experience with how important GPS is for civil aviation. How is it used on a day-to-day basis for you when you're in an airplane? Also, just maybe your thoughts on other civilian applications for GPS that you're familiar with, and kind of what that looks like to someone maybe watching today who doesn't really realize how many things they use that rely on GPS.
Yeah, you bet. So most modern aircraft have GPS integrated into all of their systems. GPS gives us three things: precise position information, precise timing information, and then information about the GPS satellite constellation. We use all three. So if we lose access to any one or more of those important components, then it degrades our operations. We use the position information for very precise navigation. The entire world has worked hard to try to optimize the use of airspace, to make it more aircraft and to make it safer. We require the position information and data link information with air traffic control to maintain that efficiency. Other safety systems utilize that position information, such as ground proximity, terrain avoidance systems. The data links that we use are all synced to that timing information. We need that precise time to log on to the data link networks. So that's data links with air traffic control, with our airlines that we're operating with, and even satellite communications. Another safety system that uses that precise time data link enabled feature is our air traffic collision avoidance system. And then the last part I mentioned was satellite information. So it tells the receiver exactly where to look for the next satellite that it needs to start tracking. And if you deny that, then you can have a case where we've seen cases where aircraft go through an interference area, they exit the area, but a couple hours later, because they had some poisoned satellite information, their GPS systems failed. So what are the impacts if we lose these capabilities? We talked about optimizing the use of airspace. So if you don't have that precise navigation, you're forced to maybe fly a longer route or at a suboptimum altitude. That increases fuel burn, that increases cost, which is eventually passed to the consumer. There are also situations, since we use GPS through every phase of flight, there are some airports where only GPS-aided approaches are available if you're trying to land in bad weather. So now if GPS is not available and it's bad weather, then you're probably not going to land there unless it's visual approach type of conditions. To try to equate this to other civilian uses. There are some criminal organizations that use GPS jammers when they hijack a vehicle that has a fleet management system. That jamming signal will blank out GPS for miles around it. So now, think about your Amazon delivery, right? When was the last time that Amazon driver had a paper map to figure out where to go? Think about if you call for a first responder. Either not having the navigation information or not having the data links that they use because the timing information is not available. That may delay response by a first responder to your needs. And can you think, I came here in a strange area, Washington, D.C., in rush hour traffic. Can you imagine being in that situation, but your car's GPS says you're in Pittsburgh? So now what do you do? So those are some of the examples of how we use GPS in every phase of flight.
Yeah, and it sounds to me that we've just gotten to the place where the way that we move things around and time things are just really relying on GPS so that we just trust that it's there. And
Correct.
that if that trust is eroded, It's really hard to say how a lot of these things are impacted because we just haven't relied on it and trusted it to the level that we do.
You bet. The aircraft we fly today, they assume GPS will be available. So when these systems were designed, it wasn't part of their thought process that there may be a time in the future where GPS will be denied to you. So that's an important thing to recognize.
And yeah, Andy, I almost drive in DC every day now, but I still use my GPS and I trust that it's going to be there. I might end up who knows where, if
Right.
the Department of Commerce or somewhere on the Hill if I didn't have that. So I feel like even me, myself, I do depend on that, and I'm not exactly sure where I'd find a paper map if I
Right.
needed to navigate DC.
Yeah.
I guess, Lisa, tell us, how did we get here? You have a lot of experience with just technologies that use GPS and use cases of GPS and people who build systems that have GPS. Why do we all use GPS now? And then just really, tell us what that threat environment looks like now from your perspective as from kind of that angle.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, yeah, it's taking a step back and understanding some more context about GPS is really important. Thousands of scientists, engineers, program managers, contractors, even NATO allies created and continue to operate and upgrade the world's first space-based and a premier satellite navigation system. And GPS is actually a Space Force and Air Force and a United States success story for the reasons that you and Andy just outlined, because we have that trust and dependability on it. It is a commercial and economic success story. It is a national security success story. And it is an aviation safety success story. And let me give you some examples to back this up. A recent National Security Space Association report noted that GPS-enabled precision strike had transformed the way that the Defense Department operates. It transformed its doctrine, its strategy, its operational concepts, and its weapon systems. A vibrant entrepreneurial commercial industry has sprung forth, actually, and the EU Space Agency estimates that over 6 billion receivers and devices are in use today. And there will be over 1 billion receivers and devices sold in subsequent years annually. In 2019, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology estimated that GPS had returned $1.4 trillion to the U.S. economy, and that's $1.7 trillion today. And let's turn now to its role in public safety and specifically aviation. 40 years ago this month, actually, GPS was the Reagan administration's spokesperson announced that GPS would be made available for civil air safety. This was in response to the Soviet Union shooting down a Korean airliner, killing 269 people on board, including a member of Congress. And from that point on, more engineers, industry experts, academicians got together and put together performance standards. They started building receivers to those performance standards, and those receivers started getting integrated into the international civil aviation community, into the general aviation system. My Uncle David and his friends rely on GPS to fly their Cessnas, helicopters, unmanned aerial systems, and that is how GPS has become such an integral part of the civil aviation system. Now, a group of over 950 volunteers, ranging from pilots to air traffic control folks to industry experts, got together recently and published a report that talked about the impacts of GPS spoofing on the aviation industry. And we absolutely applaud them for getting together and pulling together this very comprehensive report in 4.5 months. That's incredible, what the detail that they put forward. And what they noted in this report is that the vulnerabilities are becoming real. We've talked about these vulnerabilities for a very long time. We've known about the vulnerabilities. There were some things about the report that I found were really interesting, and one of those is that it was a good reminder that GPS and other global navigation satellite systems are vulnerable to threats, but that all systems are vulnerable, whether from electronic warfare to cyber to human error. Just yesterday, the Wall Street Journal noted that the leader of Hamas is resorting to handwritten notes to communicate because he's afraid of turning on electronic communications for fear of being caught, right? So this report made a couple of important findings. One, first of all, thankfully, they found at this point that airliners were not being intentionally spoofed or jammed. That's important. That's an important thing. Second, as you mentioned, Clayton, that these airlines are flying in and near conflict zones, and drones are actually, counter-drone attacks are what are impacting airlines that are flying in and around these aviation systems. The stunning part of their report is the sheer volume of attacks from July 15th to August 15th, 41,000 spoofing incidents in that 30-day period alone. The other area that I took a look at recently is some working papers submitted by governments to the International Civil Aviation Organization's 14th Air Navigation Conference. That occurred just 2 weeks ago. And countries in Asia and Southeast Asia noted as well that these cheap jammers and spoofers that you can buy online were impacting operations in that particular region. And so just, there are a range of threats that are taking place right now. And it's important to really pay attention to these threats to public safety. It's concerning.
And Lisa, when you talk about incidents, thousands of incidents, what that is probably a pilot or someone on the ship or a person saying, I've been spoofed, I've been jammed. Is that kind of where that number comes from? Someone was reporting that something's not right with what I think I should be seeing on my GPS?
Yeah, I've seen some reports, some organizations that are tracking ADSB. Help me with the acronym, please.
Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast.
Absolutely. And looking at the impacts to ADSB, a key component of civil aviation, and tracking those reports and getting those numbers. And the interesting thing is you look online and you see that the events are occurring over here and then they'll occur over here. They're shifting in different areas on a day-to-day basis. Right. So it's crowdsourced from technical information is what I'm seeing.
Yeah, and I think just that scale is hard to really believe when you think about that many users, and some of them not just responsible for themselves. It's not just that episode of The Office, I don't know if anyone remembers this one, where Dwight is following his GPS and he follows it into a lake.
I've forgotten that one.
Yeah, so just again, that trust that we have in GPS, that was an inconvenience for Dwight, but more than an inconvenience when that happens to a civilian passenger plane full of people. So just knowing the scale of this problem, the impacts, Dave, maybe tell us a little bit about how is the U.S. government approaching this problem? Outside of the U.S. government, maybe internationally or in other countries, what type of regulations or laws exist that are trying to address this problem, and maybe what's kind of on the horizon out there?
Yeah, I'll try. So, first, let me build on something you just said, and Lisa, we've asked the world to trust GPS for many, many years, going all the way back to the pronouncement by President Reagan, but then established in several policies since. But at the same time, we also ask for verification. We as the United States government do not take responsibility for every user's use of GPS all over the world. That's really a responsibility of the sovereign nation state where those users are, where the jurisdiction resides. But as I said, and I should also say that the fact of interference to GPS, whether it's intentional or unintentional, is also not new and something we've been focused on for many, many years, starting with the 1996 policy, NSTC 6, by the Clinton administration. Next, we had the 2004 policy, NSPD 39, by the Bush administration. And most recently, we have Space Policy Directive 7, by the previous administration. All of these policies have similar themes but the importance of protecting GPS from interference has built over the years. And right now we're seeing a lot of activity that is going on in the executive branch of the U.S. government. I'll just give you a couple of examples. The previous administration also released Executive Order 13905, which you may be familiar with, which talks about strengthening national resilience through responsible use of PNT. One of the agencies that we do have oversight responsibility for, and Lisa mentioned NIST, has released a foundational PNT profile to apply their existing cybersecurity framework to PNT. NIST has also published an evaluation of dependencies on critical infrastructure timing systems on GPS. That study found that there is significant timing dependencies in stock exchanges, electric power grids, telecommunication systems, and timing resiliency can be improved by developing alternative sources of PNT and augmentations and complements to GPS and global navigation satellite systems. There's a lot of work underway in DHS within the Science and Technology Directorate, as well as CSIS. Departments of Defense and Transportation, in cooperation with other departments and agencies, have studied the vulnerability of GPS and proposed complementary or alternative sources of PNT at least 3 times over the career that I've had in this business. Most recently, in response to a requirement in the National Defense Authorization Act of fiscal year 2018, DOT completed a study and report to Congress in January 2021 on complementary PNT and GPS backup technologies. So we bring this domestic approach that we pursue within the federal government to our international discussions on the issue. In my previous job in the State Department, we had responsibility for bilateral and multilateral discussions about use of GNSS, the compatibility of other global navigation satellite systems with GNSS, and things we could do collectively to ensure that users can use those systems even in the presence of threats and challenges like we're facing today. Let me stop for now there and see, Clayton, if you have anything to follow up on.
Yeah, so Dave, this is something that we've talked about before. When you look at how GNSS is handled within the UN framework, a lot of those organizations, they have United States participation, they have participation from China, they have participation from Russia. Mm-hmm. When we look at the map of where a lot of interference happens, it's hard not to think that might be associated with Russia, that might be associated with China. So how do those organizations do anything about this problem? What were they set up to do, if not look at an issue like interference?
Yeah, so Lisa already mentioned ICAO, International Maritime Organization, IMO, the ITU, International Telecommunication Union. They all do discuss this problem, look at ways to address it within their legal constructs. The organization I'm most familiar with, because my office in the State Department was responsible to lead the delegation to this group, is the International Committee on GNSS, which is a voluntary group of interested nation states, system providers, and many organizations representing users that bring together the system providers, the major nations that you talked about, and the European Union, to talk about ways to provide services in the best way possible to its users. Now, I shouldn't say we anymore, the U.S. brings a large delegation to the International Committee on GNSS with experts across all technical areas. We encourage the participation of our industry because collaboration and partnership with industry has always been the way we provide P&T services. And we talk in detail about many of these issues. What we can never do in a diplomatic environment, and Lisa knows this as well, is force another nation state to do what we want them to do. We can only have dialogues, discussions, coordination efforts. It's up to the delegations from the other nations and their experts to bring this back to their own countries, their own governments, and try to implement the things that we suggest. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't work. And that could get us into a larger discussion about international law and its limits, which we can certainly do if you'd like.
But Dave, that group, it sounds like that's composed of representatives from different countries who want to make GPS and different GNSS systems a success. It's in their interest to find ways to coordinate technical solutions. It's not necessarily the group that is doing activities like jamming and spoofing. It's actually the group that might think we should be working together on more of this. But that, if I'm hearing you right, there might be a chasm between that goal and then folks or entities that are actually doing the GPS jamming. There's not a direct link between what a group like that would do and then who's actually doing the jamming and spoofing.
Yeah, I mean, I can't talk about specific countries and how coordination within their own governments may happen, but yeah, you're absolutely right. We can't force those with like-minded views of ours as individuals representing their government to be able to go back to their nation states and ensure that everything happens the way it should. I mean, as we know, this is a dual-use technology. We have peaceful civil uses of GNSS, and we have legitimate military and national defense uses of GNSS. And in international law, when you're trying to accomplish both, that creates tension, and that's where the difficulty lies in trying to do the best we can to preserve the peaceful civil use, but also recognize that nations have the right to self-defense. Difficult issue.
I want to quickly remind those watching that we are taking questions, so feel free to go to our event page and look at the bottom, and if you have a question, please ask it. And we'll be getting to questions in about 10 minutes. I wanted to go back, Andy, to you, and now hearing there are limited tools that we have to really do anything about this problem internationally, particularly if we're looking at outside of the United States.
Yeah.
If you are in a plane and you encounter GPS interference, jamming, or spoofing, you're lucky enough to identify it. What do you do? Are there procedures? Are there things that have been planned in advance? How do you mentioned that even if you recover GPS again, the system still might have trouble figuring out where to look for the satellites.
You bet.
Put us in your shoes to tell us what happens and what the training looks like.
Sure. And let me preface my comments with ALPA. The association's stated intent is to ensure that 2 qualified pilots are always on the flight deck. When GPS interference is an example of reduced capability operations, right? Something's gone wrong, and it happens quite frequently. And when something does happen, like GPS interference, we have a clear division of duties. One pilot is in charge of flying the airplane. The other pilot is in charge of, right, let's figure out what's happening. Are we being jammed? Are we being spoofed? Is it both? What systems are being affected? Our destination, can we get to our destination with the current system, navigation system that we have? Do we have to consider going to an alternate airfield? So reacting to what ifs requires that crew of 2 pilots on board, and so there's some manufacturers that are pursuing single pilot operations. We believe in the interest of economic gain, and it's unconscionable to think that the safety of aircraft operations would be sacrificed for an economic gain. So let's get back to the specific, and I've had it flying into the Middle East. I've been jammed, and I remember one time we got spoofed.
Well, how did you know? So jamming, I get it. The GPS says
You bet.
doesn't
So
work. But
we talked
spoofing-
about the data links, and so we started seeing the ADS-B data link fell offline, and it would come back, then fell offline. and then it was gone. So now I know that our broadcasting to the ground, to air traffic control, they have much less information about what we're doing, where we are. So if you're in range of ground-based navigation aids, you can actually disable the GPS input to the navigation system and use those navigation aids to update your aircraft. But those are procedures. And so the ops group report, I'll go ahead and label it. The ops group report was great on describing what are the effects of jamming and the effects on the aircraft systems. But the concern is when you get to procedures, what pilots are doing on the flight deck, those have to be developed by manufacturers and regulator approved, okay? And then trained. For example, my airline is responsible for training. So the airline trains everybody to react in the same way. There are tens and tens of thousands of flights happening every day, and we don't want a do-it-yourself approach to reacting to GPS interference. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I think, to me, I'm wondering, and this kind of relates to a question from the audience. I'll just go ahead and kind of paraphrase that one and ask it. The question is from Dana Goward, the Resilient Navigation and Timing Foundation. Looking at systems, do we need to look at systems that complement and back up GPS for aviation? How do we protect GPS users with systems? Should they be working independently of GPS? I think, Lisa, maybe this is a question for you. Mm-hmm. I think we all hear resilience as a goal for so many things. It's used all the time. Everything is national security. Everything is about resilience. So when we talk about resilience for GPS, I think I have one answer maybe in my head when I think of national security and the military. I don't know if I have a good answer for aviation or Google or Amazon delivering packages. So for you, that's how I would encapsulate this question, really. What does resilience look like so that, Andy, maybe they don't have to we don't have to turn the thing off and figure out a way around this. Is there a way to make GPS itself more resilient that applies to both the military and then also these civilian uses?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Ops Group report said succinctly, this is no quick and easy solution, and that I think we absolutely agree with. Certainly the Lockheed is building more resilient satellites with more resilient signals that are going to be on orbit eventually, and that's a good thing. They're both civil signals as well as military signals that are going to be more jam resistant. We've just got to get those satellites up and in the active constellation. But putting a new signal in space or putting a resilient satellite system in space is a good start. But know that it takes many years to integrate those systems or those signals into a public safety application such as aviation. First of all, the performance standards need to be set for those signals and systems. Those signals and systems need to demonstrate that they have the accuracy, the availability, the integrity, and the continuity that is necessary for public safety systems. They need to be integrated into the receivers. The receivers need to be integrated into the equipment manufacturers, the Boeings, the Airbuses. And there is a lot of testing and refinement done in that process. Certainly our member companies have some ideas about some things that can be done in the near term. Certainly processes and procedures, as Andy just described, are going to be the near-term payoffs for changes to reflect and adjust as we get more resilient signals, more up in space and available to both the military as well as the general public. One that is installing antennas that are more resistant to jamming. And we support the recommendations made by both the Ops Group as well as the P&T Advisory Board and others to get controlled reception pattern antennas off of the International Trafficking in Arms regulations. Certainly there's an opportunity to apply them in aviation. They may not apply in other scenarios, other applications where GPS and other global navigation satellite systems or P&T systems come from. Actually, multi-frequency and multi-constellation receivers are another important defense against jamming and spoofing.
So do you mean one that would be able to use Galileo, for example, or even BIDO? If something was wrong with GPS, it would automatically say, let me find another PNT constellation?
As well as different frequencies transmitted by those different constellations.
How common is that now, a device that could do both? And maybe not just
Yeah.
the hardware, but for example, I know the iPhone, it has the right hardware. That doesn't mean, though, that the software is looking in the way that you're saying for that, fall over to something else if I can't see GPS. Is that kind of where we are? We don't have that technology, and where do we go so that you do have that type of redundancy? So I'm not even, that point, it's not even resilient GPS, it's not redundant GPS, it's redundant PNT, redundant GNSS.
Right, right. Actually, 87% of receivers and devices out there support 3 or more constellations. And by 2026, a research firm estimates that 95% of the market will support those different types of receivers. So, and ICAO is also moving in this direction. In March of 2023, they issued standards for dual frequency multi-constellation receivers for aviation. And so the process, ICAO is continuing to develop more and more standards to make that possible. Speaking of Galileo, Galileo certainly has a signal that is very intriguing, and we'd love to see in other scenarios. They're coming online with an authentication signal that says, hey, receiver, this is me, I did transmit that specific information. You can trust that I transmitted that you're not being spoofed. And so we think getting that in other constellations is also very important. Always updating your receiver firmware when the manufacturer recommends doing so is very, very important. It's, it's what we hear all the time. We get little device notifications on our phones, on our computers, because they found some sort of vulnerability, and keeping that updated is a very important next step.
Okay, and you mentioned Galileo. Oh, Andy, did you have a comment on that?
Go ahead, finish.
I was thinking with, and maybe this is more of a question too for Dave though, so Andy, jump in if this is something that you're not thinking about. But another thing that we hear a lot about, I would call it in the buzzword category, is international partnerships, collaboration. You talked about Galileo. So to me, I was wondering, what's the role of international collaboration to build a more redundant and resilient GPS system for civilian use in particular? Kind of channeling a question here that we have from Catherine Melbourne at the Aerospace Corporation Center for Space Policy and Strategy. Her question specifically is, how will U.S. alliances come in to building resilience and redundancy for GPS? And maybe we could broaden that just to GNSS. So that was where I was going to go, Andy, but certainly if you had something to jump in, I don't want to prevent that.
Yeah, you bet. So I wanted to comment, as Lisa says, the full development of resilient systems will take years, and it will take significant legislative efforts to have, approvals, that, as she mentioned, to get the antennas off, the specific antenna off the ITAR list, have approval to use multi-band or multi-constellation certified receivers. Most of the GPS jamming that we are seeing right now is overseas, and so the question, quite frankly, is why should we worry about it? Well, there's a few good reasons. One, U.S. flagged aircraft fly all around the world. U.S. citizens are flying all around the world, so there is an effect on U.S. aircraft and U.S. people today. And I think it's helpful to understand how we got here. So back in the 1990s, the development of GPS munitions, very expensive, and probably only used on a state-on-state warfare type of level. But when the proliferation of inexpensive drone technology emerged, and drones that could be weaponized, that's when the jamming and the spoofing really started exploding. I think a watershed event was when the Venezuelan president survived an assassination attempt from a explosive-laden drone. And after that, nations really started looking into GPS and jamming and spoofing to defend their precious assets. So on one hand, you have nations are responsible for ensuring that doesn't happen, but it's the nation states that they're doing it. So I think those are some important considerations.
And that's in the case of, the use case would be VIP protection, for example.
Right. You bet.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Maybe going back to Catherine's question, so yeah, about how do alliances fit in? Dave, just given your background in this area, I thought maybe this would be a good question for you.
Yeah, and speaking of background, I guess I should, for transparency purposes, I should say years ago, I was a former director of the Aerospace Corporation Center for Space Policy and Strategy, so I find it kind of interesting that I'm answering a question from Catherine. And I don't know if she's focused mostly on the military defense side or on the civil side.
I think civilian. She did say civilian. Sorry
Okay.
if I didn't say that.
So the only way we can do it is to engage in dialogue with other countries, with the system providers primarily, but also with countries that have large groups of users within their borders. And so that's what we've done for years, both bilaterally and multilaterally. I talked a little bit about the International Committee on GNSS. That's the primary multilateral body that I'm familiar with. We've been working on ensuring that these systems work together without doing harm to each other, compatibility, since the beginning of the ICG. We've also worked on encouraging interoperability, making sure that they all work better together than they do by themselves. In some sectors of P&T use, industry, as Lisa knows, has been taking advantage of this for years, literally 40 years when we're talking about use of GPS and GLONASS. Unfortunately, Andy works in one of the sectors that's the most challenging to address this problem. Number one, because it seems to be getting more and more prevalent for the reasons he described. Number two, aviation is global and therefore the most widely spread sector to address here. And then third, it's very slow to adopt new technology for very good reasons, for safety of life reasons. But all those things make it very challenging. This is probably one of the most difficult cases that we have to resolve. And our bilateral dialogues, our multilateral venues, we can only go so far there. Unfortunately, in the end, it takes the will of every nation state to try to protect their own self-defense and protect the users of GNSS and P&T to the best of their ability. And that's where innovation comes in from industry. And I think we may not be doing a perfect job here in the US, but I think we still have a leadership role in this area.
And so that is the rub, really, the national security side. And even, Andy, I'll throw in protection of officials or VIPs, VVIPs, however we want to say that. Yep. So all of that kind of in the same bucket. But then these civilian applications for GPS or for positioning, and navigation, and timing. That's the tricky thing that I think we're all, I'm not saying we don't have ideas, but that's, I think, where the struggle is. Yeah. One thing, it kind of ties to a question here from, it's from one of our interns, Yanni Nikas. He's an Aerospace Security Project intern. I'll throw this out for any of you. I definitely want to hear your thoughts, Lisa, on it. And it kind of goes back to where we were when we talk about resilience. Are we really talking about resilience for GPS? Are we talking about resilience for GNSS? Or are we talking about resilience for the ability to have PNT? His question is, this past August, there was a team of engineers that developed a GPS-independent drone that compared live images captured by the vehicle to a stored database of satellite imagery to determine the location of the drone. Are technologies like this one, might we see something like this emerge? And Yanni uses the word augment. I'll throw out, just to be a little sensational, replace current GPS technology. Actually, he did say replace, I just didn't get to end of it. Augment current, or replace it completely. Good job, Yanni, you read my mind.
Yeah.
So I would be curious what anyone thinks, but definitely kind of your thought, Lisa, because you're more involved in kind of that space right now that is seeing the technology being, how it's manufactured, how it's implemented, and then those users of it who really, and like you too, like you don't have a system in an airplane to look at satellite imagery on the ground. And to Dave, your point, you can't just put one in next week because you don't trust that yet. So are we talking, when we talk about resiliency, are we really talking about augmenting or replacing? Should we think of both?
We prefer to think of it as complementary. I mean, for the very reasons I talked about at the beginning, 6 billion devices and receivers in use. the integration into the financial system, into the electric grid, into aviation. Just there will be complementary systems that come along and provide. There's a company building a LEO PNT system that's going to be operating in C-band, for instance. So, a low Earth orbit position, navigation, and timing system operating in C-band, for instance. That's very complementary to GPS and other global navigation satellite systems that are operating in L-band, for instance. So I don't see GPS or other global navigation satellite systems disappearing from the aviation sector or any sectors in any time soon, but certainly the complements that will come along are going to be very important complements. Rand Corporation did a report just a few years ago and said there is no backup system for GPS, meaning no replacement system for GPS. And I think they're absolutely right, that it is such a part of our fabric. And other countries have emulated the GPS program, as you mentioned, China, Russia, the EU. And for the reasons of national prestige and international prestige that GPS brings, as well as the military, public safety, critical infrastructure, and commercial benefits it brings, they're just tremendous, and people want to emulate it. Yeah.
So I just want to add from my past experience, I would agree with Lisa, and I would say that if you kludge together literally dozens of other technologies, you might be able to come close to actually replacing GNSS. But nothing is as accurate and precise as GNSS, and nothing positions you not just on the surface of the Earth, everywhere, all the time, but even positions our planet in the universe, in our galaxy, in the solar system. You know, atomic clocks in space is the real heart of GNSS, and that's very difficult to replace. And in fact, you need to look very carefully when someone says they are a complete and total alternative to GNSS for PNT. You need to look very closely because probably they're using GPS time in their system because that's such an easy way to do it. It's the cheapest and easiest way. So are there temporary complete backups to GPS? Yes. But the answer is a large complement of different technologies. And I think the last couple of years, especially, the Department of Transportation seems to be a very good champion of that approach. And I think there's been some tension between their congressional oversight and the department, but I think we may be reaching a place where there's agreement on that. And so yeah, it's a package. And in the end, we are talking about PNT. We're talking about what does the end user need to do the job, to do their mission, to live their lives. But we can never completely, I think, get away from the value of GNSS.
You bet. Complementary systems are important. You know, we're learning that if you rely on a sole system for PNT or control of a vehicle, that any of those can be denied. The technology that you mentioned in the question, that's actually old technology. We used to have weapons that would do optical terrain matching to update their system, so not using GPS or radar or anything else. And so if you're using optical matching of terrain or features, if I know that threat is present, all I have to do is fire a laser right into that camera. I disable that camera. And if that system only uses that one method to control itself, then now it's denied. So complementary systems is the way forward.
And I've heard, oh, go ahead, Lisa, no, please.
No, go ahead, please.
No.
Well, I was going to say, in spite of, absolutely GPS is there, but there is a lot of work here to do to restore the trust in the 16 systems and subsystems that the Ops Group report identified in the aviation sector that there's confidence, that pilots have confidence that those systems are going to work for them as the way that they are advertised. Restoring that trust is absolutely important. You know, ITU issued a resolution at the World Radio Conference 2023 saying, look, we need collaboration between regulators, enforcement officials, and stakeholders to try to address these issues, that it's very important, particularly in the airline industry, particularly in the maritime industry. So there's a lot of work to be done to strengthen and enforce the laws that say that buying these small jammers are illegal. That harmful interference is not what we promote as countries, as nations, as a global system in the radio frequency spectrum.
Who do you? Oh, Dave, go
Well, I
ahead.
just wanted to say that we've been talking here just a little bit about aviation. I've been talking a lot about my previous experience in the international side of this, but in my current job, aviation, FAA is under our jurisdiction, and just in aviation, we can't forget that we have many, many issues to resolve, not just the resilience of P&T, but cybersecurity in general is a huge issue, and in fact, well, let me take the opportunity for an advertisement here. Our committee tomorrow, at the request of the chair, is having a hearing on cybersecurity impacts in the aviation sector, focused on the domestic side and focused on infrastructure like airports. But we can't forget that when we're talking about P&T, it's one technology in a broad portfolio of things that we need to provide service to our citizens. And so on the domestic side, we have a lot of priorities to look at here if we're talking about Congress.
I think they're scalping tickets for that hearing out front. CSIS minutes.
I doubt
But
it.
maybe we can get some free from you, Dave. We're almost getting out of time. We have about 8 minutes-ish left. I want to go back to something, Lisa, that when you were talking about we should do these things, it's not, when you have a task and you hear we, I'm always like, well, who? Who's the you do this?
Yeah.
So, I'm curious if you have any thoughts, Lisa, or anyone else, Dave or Andy, on like who's the we? Who? If we're just want to look at the U.S. government, it sounds like it's 25 people representing different agencies and commission. That person should be the one, or 2 people should be the ones. What your thoughts on who that should be within the government, the U.S. government?
That is an excellent question. That I think it's not just solely the U.S. government. It has to be the stakeholders, the receiver manufacturers, the satellite builders and manufacturers. It has to include the academics. There are some really strong academics in position navigation and timing located all around the world. There are scientists. There are folks who make systems that are simulate these signals that should be a part of that conversation. And the U.S. government, but I do think that the U.S. government has an important role to play here. And from my time in the government, I am mostly used to seeing the National Security Council and the OSTP jointly come together to address P&T related issues. But at some point, there are roles for every part of the U.S. government, because every part of the U.S. government, one, uses GNSS and GPS systems, and 2, they have an important voice to bring their missions forward and the missions of the people that they represent in the United States and across the globe to those conversations. So I'll punt with that very nebulous answer.
Okay, no, that's a great one. Quickly, do either of you have any thoughts on this? I have one final question that we can look at from
Congress,
Yeah,
of course.
I would say-
I was going to say Congress.
Congress,
No,
of
Congress.
course.
but when we're talking about executing a service for the U.S. citizens and then the citizens of the world, that's an executive branch job, and the leadership has to come from the presidential administration. I mean, everybody wants one single leader, but in most cases, that's not how the U.S. government works. It's a collaboration. And then Congress has to provide appropriate oversight. Congress has to provide appropriate funding through appropriations. and also work in partnership with the executive branch. And it takes everyone to do that. And as much as we'd often like to see one single cabinet secretary be responsible for everything that's related to P&T, for example, that's just not the reality that we live in. And we have to take advantage of our system and show the world that it works. We're very transparent. We utilize experts from all kinds of sectors in academia and industry through things like advisory boards. And we know that we have a very active advisory board in the P&T area. And that's good for us. That's a benefit. And that's the kinds of things we try to explain to the rest of the world.
And we have people like Andy who have generously given their time today to bring their expertise to us. They are dealing with these issues on a day-to-day basis and immensely valuable as well.
I have two things that keep me up at night that I'll share. One is, Lisa talked about restoring the trust in the system. Pilots have just 4 instances of if a situation comes up, you have to react immediately. So terrain avoidance, traffic avoidance, wind shear escape, and then stalled aircraft or upset. We've already seen a spoofing event where the terrain avoidance system was fooled, and an aircraft at 30-something thousand feet is saying, pull up, train ahead. And so it undermines the training that all pilots go through. So if that happens, if you get that warning later, do I have time to troubleshoot? Is this a false signal? Where am I? The impact is 1995, an airliner crashed in high terrain in Colombia. The investigation showed there were 12 seconds from when the warning was given to impact. And so if you have doubts about the system and you have to start thinking through it, that 12 seconds goes really quickly. The other thing that keeps me up at night. So I would say jamming is a really painful annoyance, right? It drives inefficiencies and increases cost. But spoofing is a threat. And the most nefarious case I could think of is we avoid conflict zones. So if I'm flying around a conflict zone and I get spoofed, and in reaction to the spoofing, I fly into the conflict zone, there could be disastrous results. Malaysian 217 getting shot down over Ukraine is a perfect example. So the threat is out there, and the need for us to take the near-term and long-term solutions and get them out into the aviation operations world is manifest.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty good way to end our discussion. I was going to ask, and I'll just point out what his question was. Jacob Bradley, he's an intern with the Aerospace Security Project. He had a question more about what civilians should be doing to defend themselves, but hearing kind of our last few words here, it's more what should they be aware of? And then maybe there's a role of civilians to figure out, this is how I think this should be done better. But we don't even, if we're calling ourselves experts, we don't even have right answers for that. So it's just an awareness right now, I think, that we're all calling for of what that trust means, why people should care, your average person on the street in Washington, D.C. I hope we've been able to explain that to those folks watching today, why it matters. We don't have an action plan to say this is what should be done. We think that it sounds like there's more work that could be done, but we don't have answers. And I think we just tried to educate today with this discussion, and I hope we accomplished that. So I do thank everyone for participating on the panel today. Thank you for coming to CSIS. Thank you for all our online viewers for watching and asking questions, and I hope you join us next time for another discussion.